In September 2019, Cat McNichol lifted the latch on an enclosure. For the first time in 160 years, a pine marten set foot on English soil. It had been transported 600 kilometers from the Scottish Highlands. Each animal was fitted with a radio collar. Suddenly, something in the forest began to change. This was just the first of 18. By 2021, there would be 35. The target was the gray squirrel population, a species that over 120 years had effectively displaced the red squirrel from England. 35 animals against several million. What happened next was something the scientists had not planned. The marten barely hunted gray squirrels, but somehow their population fell. To understand why, you first need to understand exactly who was released into that forest. The pine marten is a native inhabitant of British woodland. It has been here for 10,000 years. In the 19th century, the owners of hunting estates declared the marten a pest. It ate pheasants. Hunting syndicates paid for pelts, and traps were set across every forest. By the early 20th century, the animal had virtually disappeared from England and Wales. Only isolated populations survived in the Scottish Highlands. A separate catastrophe was unfolding in parallel. In 1876, at Henbury Park near Macclesfield in Cheshire, a banker named Thomas Brocklehurst released a pair of gray squirrels he had brought from America as pets. Victorians were fond of the exotic. By the 1930s, the gray squirrel had spread across all of England, displacing the red squirrel through two mechanisms: direct competition for food and the squirrelpox virus. The gray squirrel carries it and does not fall ill. The red squirrel dies. The trajectory of the red squirrel's numbers in England looks like this: 3.5 million across the whole of Britain before the greys arrived. Roughly 287,000 today across the entire UK. Of those, only around 39,000 in England. The red squirrel in England now survives only in a handful of isolated pockets in the north. In the Forest of Dean, it has not been seen for decades. But there is a further dimension to this catastrophe that is rarely discussed in the context of conservation. The gray squirrel strips the bark from young trees to reach the sweet sap beneath. For the tree, this is often fatal. According to Forestry Commission estimates, the annual damage to the British forestry industry from gray squirrels exceeds at least £37 million a year. This is not an ecological abstraction. It is a budget line. And that is precisely why the question of why bother bringing the marten back at all has an answer that goes beyond sentiment toward the red squirrel. The idea was simple in theory and strange in practice. If the pine marten was returned, it would eat enough gray squirrels to push the population below a critical threshold. And then the red squirrel could recover on its own. The skeptics had specific arguments. I want to state them clearly because they are not trivial. First, 35 animals against tens of thousands of gray squirrels is mathematically absurd. A single marten cannot physically eat enough squirrels to have any meaningful effect on the population. If it catches one or two a week, that is a drop in the ocean. Second, the marten is a generalist predator. It eats everything: voles, birds, eggs, berries, carrion. Why would it choose the gray squirrel specifically, rather than something easier? Third, if the marten learns to hunt squirrels, it will eat red ones too. This could make the situation worse, not better. All three arguments are logically sound. And there is one more biological fact that explains why all of this takes so long. The marten mates in July and August. But pregnancy does not begin immediately. The embryo literally halts its development for 7 months and implants only in February or March. The young are born in spring, when prey is plentiful. 1 litter per year, a maximum of 5 kits. This is not nature being lazy, it is a precise evolutionary calculation. But it also means that a population of 35 individuals cannot double in a year. Here, patience is not a virtue, it is the only option. The problem was that no one had accounted for one fact that turned out to be the key to everything. Ireland provided the answer sooner than anyone expected. The pine marten in Ireland was not reintroduced. It simply survived there, a small, fragmented population. But after the Wildlife Act of 1976 gave it legal protection, the population began slowly to recover. Emma Sheehy, a researcher at the University of Aberdeen, noticed something unusual in 2014. In areas of Ireland where martens were increasing in number, the gray squirrel was disappearing. Not merely declining, disappearing entirely. And the red squirrel was returning on its own, without any human assistance, into forests where it had not been seen for decades. In 2018, Sheehy and her team published a paper in Proceedings of the Royal Society B that for the first time quantified this mechanism. The key finding was this: the presence of martens strongly negatively correlates with the presence of gray squirrels, and positively with the presence of red squirrels. The effect is asymmetric. The gray squirrel reacts to the marten far more acutely than the red squirrel does. Why? Here is where the most interesting part lies. The red squirrel and the pine marten have been evolutionary neighbors for tens of thousands of years. They live together in the same forests. The red squirrel knows the scent of the marten, not through experience, but through instinct. When it detects that scent, it changes its behavior, spending less time on the ground and more time on the thin branches of the canopy. But even there, the marten is not helpless. It is the only member of the entire mustelid family with semi-retractile claws, like a cat's. It can hold on to a branch where no other similar animal could physically maintain its grip. The red squirrel knows this. The gray squirrel does not. The gray squirrel comes from North America. It has never encountered martes. There are different mustelids there, different predators, a different evolutionary memory. The scent of the European pine marten is an empty signal to it. It simply does not register it as a threat. The research revealed a paradoxical consequence. The gray squirrel, in the presence of the marten, actually increased its activity in areas with feeding stations, the very places martens visited most frequently. A maladaptive response, that is the term from Sheehy's paper. Simply put, it walked into the jaws of a predator it had no capacity to fear. But there is another factor, and it proved to be even more significant. Even when the marten is not actively catching gray squirrels on a given day, the mere presence of the marten in the forest changes the behavior of the grays. They eat less, accumulate less fat, survive winter less well, and reproduce less. The chronic stress of a threat they are unable to correctly assess undermines the population slowly but systematically. Here is a detail that makes this picture even more extraordinary. The pine marten regularly uses gray squirrel drays as its own den, for resting and even for giving birth. The gray squirrel builds the nest. The marten moves in. Sometimes the marten raises its young there. The predator literally lives in the house of its prey. If the gray returns, it finds the marten inside. This is not a metaphor for a landscape of fear. It is the literal enactment of one. Sheehy found confirmation of this in Irish data. In the Fermanagh area of Northern Ireland, the gray squirrel population collapsed to virtually zero after the marten returned to the region, without large-scale hunting, without poisoning, without human intervention. A later review, the 2019 All-Ireland Survey, confirmed the pattern. Across the entire island, there is an expansion of the marten's range and a simultaneous contraction of the gray squirrel's range in the same regions. But it is worth pausing on one figure that is easy to overlook. The pine marten received legal protection in Ireland in 1976. The first documented changes in squirrel distribution, the first signs that something was happening, were recorded in 2007. Between legal protection and the first measurable effect, 31 years had passed. Not 3 years of a program with key performance indicators. Not 5 years of a grant cycle. 31 years of quiet work by an ecosystem before it became visible on a map. This matters when someone asks, so did it work in the Forest of Dean? What does the marten actually eat? Field voles form the basis of the diet. According to Scottish research, they make up as much as 36% of the winter diet. Birds and eggs in spring and summer. Berries in autumn, sometimes up to half of the diet. Insects, frogs, carrion. The marten eats what is available. Gray squirrels account for roughly 10 to 15% of the marten's diet according to Irish data. No more than that. For comparison, in Scandinavia, martens may eat red squirrels. They're up to 30% of the winter diet. But in the forests of Britain and Ireland, gray squirrels are far more numerous, larger bodied, and spend more time on the ground, which makes them the more accessible prey. Most importantly, the marten cannot switch exclusively to squirrels, even if squirrel numbers fall. It shifts to voles, eggs, berries. This means that when the gray squirrel disappears, the marten does not start eating more reds. It eats something else. That is precisely what closes the main question posed by the skeptics. Predation pressure does not transfer to the reds once the grays are gone, because the martens were eating primarily something else all along. By 2022, 3 years after the reintroduction began, the marten population in the Forest of Dean had already exceeded 40 individuals. Natural increase. The animals had bred. But here's what proved surprising. The mechanism turned out to be far more complex than marten eats squirrel. Researchers recorded that in some areas of the Forest of Dean, gray squirrel activity had declined. But direct evidence of widespread predation, such as found remains and filmed hunts, is limited. The effect is real, but the mechanism is most likely that very landscape of fear rather than straightforward predation. And here is the second surprise. The Forest of Dean is a difficult test case. This is not the Scottish Highlands or the Irish countryside. It is a forest that borders the suburbs of Gloucester. There are roads, there are people, there is infrastructure. Martens are killed by cars. At least several individuals died that way in the first years. The effect that unfolded naturally in Ireland over more than 20 years is being replicated here artificially and quickly in a fragmented landscape. At this point, it is too early to speak of success. But there is one more detail that almost no one mentions. The red squirrel is not simply an appealing animal with ear tufts. It is an architect of the forest. Like the gray squirrel, the red caches acorns and nuts for winter, but it forgets some of them. Those forgotten nuts germinate. Researchers have calculated that the red squirrel plants thousands of trees every year simply through forgetfulness. Oak, beech, hazel. In the Forest of Dean, where the gray squirrel held sway for decades, that process was running with an American repertoire. The wrong trees, the wrong rhythm, the wrong burial depth. If the marten returns part of the forest to the reds, it will return the forest its architect. There is a question the Forest of Dean program does not answer, and one for which there is as yet no answer. What happens in cities? The marten does not enter London or other large urban areas. There is no continuous woodland there, no cover, no sufficient food resource. It is precisely in urban parks and suburbs that the gray squirrel thrives most. Nothing there holds it in check. This means that even if the Forest of Dean becomes a success, the gray squirrel will not disappear from the urban landscape of England. There is no natural regulator for it there. No marten will ever enter those places. Ireland has already shown this same picture. Even in places where the marten has completely displaced the gray from rural forests. In Belfast and Dublin, the gray has gone nowhere. Urban populations exist separately from woodland ones, living in parks and gardens, and the marten does not enter. This means that winning in the forest and winning altogether are two different things. The forest ecosystem and the urban ecosystem follow different rules. No predator reintroduction program will close that gap. But here is one development that emerged after the Forest of Dean launch began, and which is worth knowing about. The UK Squirrel Accord, a coalition of government agencies and conservation organizations, is funding the development of an oral contraceptive for gray squirrels. This is not a poison, not a trap. It is a vaccine in a food bait, delivered through feeding stations fitted with an electronic weight-sensitive lock that opens only for animals heavier than 450 grams. The gray squirrel is heavier, the red is not. The lock will not let the red in. In November 2025, researchers at the Animal and Plant Health Agency announced the world's first recorded case of achieving infertility in rats through free feeding of an oral immunocontraceptive. A response has also been recorded in gray squirrels, and the formulation is currently being refined. The target date for market release is 2030. If this works, the marten solves the problem in the forest, and the contraceptive solves it in the city. Two different solutions for two different ecosystems. For the first time in 150 years, there is a potential answer to both questions at once. This is a question about what to do with invasive species in an urbanized environment where a natural solution is physically impossible. And in Britain, that question does not yet have an answer. There is one more thing worth reflecting on. The Irish case, the closest analogy to what is happening in the Forest of Dean, unfolded over more than 20 years. This is not a 5-year program with clear key performance indicators. It is a geological process by human standards. Sheehy and her team in 2018 described the outcome of something that began in the 1990s. We are looking at the first chapter of a book that has not yet been written. 35 animals in a forest on the border of England and Wales. Decades ahead. And in the meantime, here is what has been documented in County Fermanagh in Northern Ireland. In 2012, the grey and red squirrels were still divided along a line running through Lough Erne. The north of the county held greys, the south held reds. By 2019, the grey squirrel had retreated from the entire county. Not from individual forests, from the entire county. Precise figures for the red squirrel's recovery are not yet available. Monitoring is ongoing, but one fact stands. Where the grey disappeared, the red appeared, on its own, without human intervention, simply because the marten returned first. 35 animals in a forest on the border of England and Wales are waiting for their fair manna, decades ahead.